his delight. So apparently cheating in buying and selling in the marketplace isn't anything new. So that goes back. I don't know if you want to turn there. I'm just going to read it, how this is worded in the law, Leviticus 19, verses 35 and 36. Note the difference between law versus the proverb. You shall do no wrong in judgment, in measurement of weight or capacity. You shall have just balances, just weights, a just ephah, and a just hin. I am the Lord your God who brought you out from the land of Egypt. That just sounds legislative, doesn't it? It just sounds like law. But that same thing is worded in this proverb this way. A false balance is an abomination to the Lord, but a just weight is his delight. I kind of like that a little better, but they both say the same thing, and that's the beauty of Scripture. We have the same things repeated in different genres of literature, and that's a blessing. Literally, a false balance in Hebrew is a scale of deceit. And of course, the picture is of the balance, and you're buying a pound of whatever, a pound of beans, we'll say, but the rock of the merchant really isn't a pound. It may be 13 ounces, and so you're getting cheated. And strong word, that's an abomination to the Lord. So that says something about Christian businessmen, Christian businesswomen. Of course, in this internet age, we don't have yellow pages much anymore, but remember the good old days of yellow pages? And we used to have a Christian yellow pages that we would get and make available. And every now and then, someone would say, hey, I hired so-and-so out of the Christian yellow pages, and they ripped me off. Yeah, that's unfortunate, and that's what the Lord is addressing here. Verse 2, when pride comes, then comes dishonor, but with the humble is wisdom. We might translate that first phrase woodenly, pride comes, calamity follows. That says it pretty harshly, but that's the reality of it. Here's how a commentator by the name of Waltke puts it. The wicked invite pride to come as their guest, but an inseparable twin, disgrace, comes along with her as an uninvited guest. And that's true. If we want a Bible example, I often try to come up with Bible examples to illustrate the Proverbs. King Nebuchadnezzar, wouldn't he be a good example of that? A great man, but because of pride, eating grass like an animal out in the field. Verse 3, the integrity of the upright will guide them, but the crookedness of the treacherous will destroy them. How about Obadiah and Ahab? Not the prophet Obadiah, but Obadiah in the Ahab story, if you want examples. 4, riches do not profit in the day of wrath, but righteousness delivers from death. Now, on the one hand, we've seen some proverbs that say riches are the result of hard, honest work, but this proverb reminds us, hey, they won't do you much good at death, will they? If you're in a hospice bed, you're not going to, all the money in the world isn't going to be able to buy you out of that situation. We often say you can't take it with you. Though sometimes in church we follow that up by saying you can send it ahead. There's a rabbinic proverb that says, shrouds have no pockets. How true that is. Bible example, maybe the rich man in the Lord's story about the rich man and Lazarus, and we can contrast him with Noah for the positive example. The integrity of the upright will guide them. Verse 5, the righteousness of the blameless will smooth his way, but the wicked will fall by his own wickedness. We've heard this over and over again. This is an important truth, stated slightly different ways in whatever proverb we might happen to be looking at. Of course, the word blameless does not mean perfect. This is a word that would be used of the person bringing the lamb for the sacrifice, which suggests that they're not sinlessly perfect, otherwise they wouldn't be bringing a lamb. And the priest didn't examine the person, he examined the lamb. The word smooth there, probably keying off the idea that Israel, if you know anything of the geography and topography, really hilly and rocky. But the wickedness of the wicked will cause him to stumble and fall. If you want a Bible example, how about contrasting Joseph of the book of Genesis with his hating brothers as an example there of verse 5. Verse 6, the righteousness of the upright will deliver them, but the treacherous will be caught by their own greed. We could put it this way, eventually righteousness always pays off. There may not be an immediate payoff to righteousness, but eventually it always pays off. Now it takes faith to believe that. I'm going to do the right thing in this situation. It doesn't make sense. I don't know how this is going to turn out, but I'm going to do it. And a righteous person's righteousness will deliver him or her, for example, when being accused of some wrongdoing, because sometimes your reputation will carry the day and win the day, but dishonesty will eventually expose itself. The rabbis sometimes put it this way, if you always tell the truth, you don't have to remember what you said. If you want a Bible example, how about Esther gaining the favor of her kingly husband by her previous behavior, and contrast that with Haman. Verse 7, when a wicked man dies, his expectation will perish, and the hope of strong men perishes. So at death, everything he hoped for, it's gone. So because the wicked live for the here and now, when they die, what they hope to obtain vanishes. The rich fool in Jesus' parable is a case in point. That'd be Luke 12:20. So would Haman in the book of Esther. Verse 8, the righteous is delivered from trouble, but the wicked takes his place. Well, that might be hard to come up with examples of that, but there are actually quite a few of them. The Lord delivered the Israelites to the Red Sea, but he drowns the Egyptian soldiers in that very sea. Haman was hanged on the gallows that he built to hang his enemy, Mordecai. Daniel was delivered from the lion's den, but his accusers perished in that very lion's den. And an angel rescued Peter from prison, and it was an angel who killed Herod, who had imprisoned Peter. So indeed, the righteous is delivered from trouble, but so often the wicked takes the place. Verse 9, with his mouth the godless man destroys his neighbor, but through knowledge the righteous will be delivered. Potiphar's wife seeks to destroy Joseph, but through his true knowledge of God, he obtains deliverance. Now verses 10 and 11 both talk about a city. When it goes well with the righteous, the city rejoices, and when the wicked perish, there is joyful shouting. And when things went well for righteous David, the city rejoiced, Israel rejoiced. And in verse 11, the blessing of the upright, by the blessing of the upright, a city is exalted, but by the mouth of the wicked it is torn down. The laws of the land should reward the righteous and punish the wicked. That doesn't always happen. David's uprightness here leads to the establishment of Jerusalem. That'd be 2 Samuel chapter 5. But the words of the last four kings of Judah would be an example of being overthrown and demise. Contrast there. Verse 12, he who despises his neighbor lacks sense, but a man of understanding keeps silent. Remember Shimei? I can't remember if I don't think I covered that story in my David series. Shimei is, David is leaving Jerusalem, is cursing him, and one of David's men says, hey, let me take off his head. And David says no. So his restrained response of David, that illustrates the second part there of verse 12. keeping silence. Don't put on the gloves. Don't get in the boxing ring, okay? Stay out of it, the proverb is saying. Verse 13, he who goes about as a talebearer reveals secrets, but he who is trustworthy conceals a matter. Paul alerted Timothy in 1 Timothy 5:13 of the tendency of the younger widows to potentially do that. But a person of trust, on the other hand, doesn't share everything he or she knows. Sometimes things need to be kept between us and the Lord, and that is trustworthiness. Verse 14, where there is no guidance, the people fall, but in abundance of counselors there is victory. This occurs many times in the book of Proverbs, the blessing of having a multitude of counselors, which doesn't necessarily mean, okay, you've got 5 people you seek their advice, and if 3 say this and 2 say this, well, the 3 win. That's automatically the will of the Lord. Not necessarily, but always that's a good thing to get a multitude of counselors in the picture there. I think of Acts 15, the early Christians wrestling with there in that first business meeting. Pastor Brown called it often, getting a number of individuals and letting them have their say as far as figuring out how we are going to resolve that. I wasn't real familiar with this. I've heard this term before, the Mossad in Israel. I think that's kind of their CIA in Israel. But on their logo in Israel is this verse, Proverbs 11:14. They probably don't interpret it probably exactly as we would, but found it fascinating. Verse 15, he who is guarantor for a stranger will surely suffer for it, but he who hates being a guarantor is secure. We've dealt with that before. The extreme caution Proverbs throws out there about co-signing for a loan. Verse 16, a gracious woman attains honor. And ruthless men attain riches. How about Abigail and Ruth for good examples of that? 17, the merciful man does himself good, but the cruel man does himself harm. I read a commentator who mentioned Isaac in Genesis 26, and I drew a blank, so I had to go back to Genesis 26, and that was the account where Isaac was digging wells, and there kept being controversy, and eventually Isaac, being merciful and not being in a fight about it, ended up with a well. Also, that same chapter deals with Abimelech and lying to Abimelech, and they parted ways, not on too friendly terms, but eventually things are patched up by the end of the chapter. Verse 18, the wicked earns deceptive wages, but he who sows righteousness gets a true reward. I mentioned Haman a number of times. He's such a great example in a bad sort of way, but he reaps a bitter harvest for his wicked sowing. And I suppose the ultimate example here positively would be Jesus receiving nothing but glory for the sowing that he did. Verse 19, he who is steadfast in righteousness will attain to life, and he who pursues evil will bring about his own death. I think life there is John 10:10, the abundant life. Jesus came that we might have life and have it to the full, have an abundant sort of life. Proverbs talks about that over and over again. To follow the path of righteousness, the path of wisdom, you will have that kind of a life. King Hezekiah might be a good example of that, and we'll contrast him with King Sennacherib, who brings about his own death. Verse 20, the perverse in heart are an abomination to the Lord, but the blameless in their walk are his delight. There'd be a good study. What are specifically the things that are an abomination to the Lord? Well, there's 2 verses in Proverbs that list, 7 of them. That'd be interesting. What's the total list of things specifically God says He loathes, He detests them? Well, here is one of them. But those who are blameless in their walk are His delight. That'd be a great prayer every morning. Father, let me be a delight to you. Imagine that. We're just a bunch of maggots, really, compared to our great God, and we can delight God. What a blessing that is. You want to example that? How about Saul versus David? We reviewed that this past Sunday. Had a great time reviewing that series and then flinging some frogs here in the front of the auditorium. Verse 21, assuredly the evil man will not go unpunished, but the descendants of the righteous will be delivered. Cain versus Abel. Verse 22, as a ring of gold in a swine's snout, so is a beautiful woman who lacks discretion. If you type in on a Google search, Google Images, and this verse reference, wow, there's some really hilarious artist's rendering of this verse, and convey in picture form what this verse is teaching. Now remember how Jews felt about pigs, so to make this illustration even more powerful. So wearing a ring in the nose in Bible times was a thing of beauty, and so a beautiful woman is noticeable, but then she opens her mouth and starts blaspheming or cursing, and wow, too bad she wasn't ugly, so her character and her speech wouldn't have been consistent with that. What a waste of beauty. I don't think it was wrong, but there have been times where there have been certain women where I've thought of this verse when I've thought of them. Beautiful woman, but wow, because of her character, ring of gold in a swine's snout. Verse 23, the desire of the righteous is only good, but the expectation of the wicked is wrath. Think of the story of Jeremiah and King Zedekiah. Verse 24, there is one who scatters and yet increases all the more, and there is one who withholds what is justly due, and yet it results only in want. We've seen this before. If you are a generous person, the book of Proverbs teaches, as a general rule, you will have plenty. Now, that doesn't logically make sense. Wait a minute. The more I give away, the more I'm going to lack. Nope, not according to God's word. And the more miserly you are, the more you will tend to be in poverty. Doesn't make sense, but God's math, God's finances are much different than the world's. And why is that? Because God blesses the giver. Now, technically we don't give so we get. The charismatics have pushed that over the line to a degree that's unbiblical, but it is true nonetheless. As we give, God will honor and by and large reward that faithfulness and enable us to be even more generous and more faithful. How about the church at Philippi, a poor church, dirt poor, and yet they just couldn't wait to give to the ministry of the Apostle Paul. And God honored that. Contrast that with, how about Nabal, wealthy man, and yet here he wouldn't share any at sheep shearing time with the men of David who had actually protected him. And verse 25, the generous man will be prosperous, and he who waters will himself be watered. Similar theme to verse 24 that we just looked at. Reminder that water was a very valuable commodity in Israel, in ancient Israel. We just take it for granted. We turn a handle and we get all the water we want. We can have hot water and cold water. We can have filtered water. You name it. But this again contradicts our logic. To be generous means I'll be prosperous. Well, that takes faith. This is what the Bible teaches. And God will honor that. Verse 26, he who withholds grain, the people will curse him, but blessing will be on the head of him who sells it. I think of Joseph. Remember, he had all these storage units of grain, was able to feed not only Egypt, but the entire world. I can't remember if it's coming up this Sunday or very soon. Nehemiah is going to share with the people of God out of his own wealth to be a blessing to them. Paul did that. Jesus did that. Again, we could contrast that with the stinginess of Nabal. Verse 27, he who diligently seeks good seeks favor, but he who seeks evil, evil will come to him. Don't be looking for evil. You're guaranteed you'll find it. So don't be looking for it. Diligently seeking good seeks favor. How about Caleb? That was his mindset. And wow, he will eventually reap the benefits of that when he's an old man, but an old man still in great physical shape. Contrast that with Adoni Bezek. I can't remember offhand where he showed up. You see, in Judges, don't know the chapter. In the book of Judges, remember, he's the guy who had his thumbs and big toes cut off, and he had to admit, well, I guess I deserve this, because 70 kings, I cut off their thumbs and big toes, and they ate scraps under my table. Well, he experienced what Proverbs 11:27 says. He who seeks evil, evil will come to him. Not necessarily exactly what you did, but sometimes God does indeed do that to really get our attention. Verse 28, he who trusts in his riches will fall, but the righteous will flourish like the green leaf. So I think just last week we were looking at some Proverbs that talks about riches are a fortress. There is a blessing to having wealth, but we balance that with so many Proverbs who make this point. Riches can be good, but not if you put your trust in them. Then it's going to backfire. Of course, there are plenty of wealthy, godly people in Scripture. The issue is trust. Where is your trust? Put your trust in the provider, capital P, not in his provision. Well, that's a tendency, just like we tend to worship creation. Man tends to worship creation rather than the Creator. We tend to get all wrapped up in his provision rather than him as the provider. Those riches are not your riches. They're God's, and he's given them to you. Recall the rich fool in Jesus' story. Verse 29, he who troubles his own house will inherit wind, and the foolish will be servant to the wise-hearted. Oh, wow, too many people can tell that story. Too many Christians, unfortunately, can tell that story about whatever it's abuse or alcoholism or divorce or whatever that might have been their experience. Verse 30, the fruit of the righteous is a tree of life, and he who is wise wins souls. Now, I know this has been used sometimes to promote evangelism. Obviously, that's not what Solomon has in mind here. He wasn't thinking of sharing the gospel. The idea here is that wise people influence others to pursue the course of wisdom. Okay, now indirectly, by way of application, okay, it's a wise thing to share the gospel and to obey the gospel. But in a broader sense here, influencing others to follow the way of wisdom, reaching out to others and helping them to walk the right path. And verse 31, and I think we actually did it in less than 31 minutes, as the goal was for tonight at least. If the righteous will be rewarded in the earth, how much more the wicked and the sinner? as we have so often, an ellipsis. Something is left out, it's understood. So if the righteous will be rewarded in the earth, how much more will the wicked and the sinner be rewarded in the earth? Typically in English, we would say it, but often in Bible languages, they don't say it. It's understood. And the translators have to decide, are we going to add it and put it in italics or leave it out? So the teaching here is no one sins with impunity. God will judge every sin. Nobody gets away with it. They may seem to get away with it temporarily, but no one gets away with it. Ungodly people appear to prosper and live carefree lives, but they don't experience the blessing of fellowship with God. That actually is the greatest blessing of human life, is it not? So lots of examples of this, righteous being rewarded: Job, Abraham, David, and Paul. And we can contrast them with all of the kings of Israel, which by and large were all wicked, and the wicked kings of Israel. There were some good, of Judah. There were some. So I don't know, I just wanted to try that, see if I could cover an entire chapter of Proverbs in one night. So I'll see. You can give me some feedback later what your preference is. So just something different to